Okay, Tony's ready. So good morning, everybody. I'm going to get us started here with the executive committee. Borrowing Bob's laptop. So this is call to order of XCOM for our summer 2025 meeting. I'm going to go to approval of the agenda. Are there any additions or edits to the agenda this morning? Not seeing any. Good. Well, I think we can hopefully get through this one fairly quickly then. So we'll consider the agenda approved as is, and approval of the meeting summary for our spring meeting. Any edits or concerns with our spring summary for XCOM? Not seeing any. Good. So we'll consider the summary from May 2025 approved. We'll go to public comment. Is there any public comment for items? Not seeing any. Very good. And I will go to Alexander for the legislative update.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to be focusing on three main documents that we've recently received: the President's FY26 budget request, the FY26 Commerce, Justice, and Science Senate Appropriations Bill, and the FY26 Commerce, Justice, Science House Appropriations Bill. I'm focusing on these documents because little has been introduced since I last spoke to you all that I both expect to pass and has a major impact upon the Commission. There's two exceptions to that, the Shark Act and then Sportfish Restoration Reauthorization. I'll update you on those after discussing the various funding proposals. The President's FY26 proposed budget, we received a preview of this proposal back in April with the leaked OMB passback memo. I know many of you folks around the table had discussed that and potential impacts on your various agencies at that time. It calls for, frankly, a lot of cuts, many of the programs that we care about. It calls for the elimination of species recovery grants, the elimination of Interjurisdictional Fisheries Act grants, the elimination of joint enforcement agreements, elimination of Sea Grant, elimination of habitat conservation programs within NOAA, a 29% cut to National Marine Fisheries Service, and then regional councils and commissions would receive a small bump up. So the Senate CJS bill is very different to the President's proposed budget. Frankly, it's very favorable to our priorities. It includes $3 million for an industry-based trawl survey pilot program, $2.5 million for the Chesapeake Bay Menhaden survey. This is the first time funding has been attached to the Chesapeake Bay Menhaden language that we've received in the past, which is a positive sign. It would give $30 million through ASMFC to the states for North Atlantic right whale recovery activities. A $10 million bump up to NOAA's fisheries data collection, surveys, and assessment line, including fully funding NEMAP and CMAP. It would fully fund the Horseshoe Crab Trawl Survey and give $14 million for cooperative research. And it fully funds Interjurisdictional Fisheries Act grants, species recovery grants, and some more things. Included in that bill is what they call a congressionally directed spending request or an earmark for $825,000 to help retrofit the Lady Lillian down in South Carolina, the boat that's helping out with some of the CMAP surveys. The House CJS bill proposes massive cuts to a couple of the NOAA line items that we pay attention to. This includes fisheries data collection, surveys, and assessments. For the past 2 years, because of the CR, that line item has been at $205 million each year. The House proposes cutting it down to $120 million, so $85 million reduction there. It still does explicitly fund NEMAP and CMAP fully. The regional councils, commissions line and interjurisdictional fisheries act grants are kind of held at a status quo level. There are some smaller cuts to the NOAA's enforcement line, species recovery grants, and observers. The House bill would also fully fund the horseshoe crab trawl survey. The House bill is heavily focused on Gulf activities and red snapper. There's lots of language in there about state-run management of red snapper and how red snapper should be managed by NOAA. Of all three funding proposals, the Senate bill is obviously the most generous to our priorities. The House bill doesn't zero anything out like the president's budget does, but it does call for some major cuts to programs that we care about. None of these proposals are set in stone yet, obviously. The fiscal year is up September 30th. Both the House and Senate are on what they call August recess. So they're out of town until early September. So they have less than a month to pass all 12 appropriations bills, which is not going to happen. They're likely going to need a 2 to 3 month CR and pass what they can before considering maybe longer term CR. There is the potential for a government shutdown, but I think both parties will try and avoid that if possible. Updates on Sharked and Sportfish. Sharked, as a reminder, would create a task force which ASMFC would be a participant in to discuss shark behavior and shark depredation of recreational fisheries. There would be a requirement for at least one ASMFC representative to participate in that focus group. Unclear if it would be ASMFC staff or commissioners. They don't necessarily clarify within the bill. Shark passed out of the House and was introduced in the Senate recently and had a short hearing on it. The Sportfish Restoration Reauthorization Bill passed out of the House Natural Resources Committee via unanimous consent, but has not been introduced in the Senate yet. As a reminder, this would switch the commissions over from a fixed $200,000 per year allocation of funding to a percent that changes based off of the total amount of the fund, with a floor of $200,000. The House sponsors of the bill are asking for co-sponsors. So I encourage all of you to reach out to your congressional offices to see if they would co-sponsor the bill. Happy to help facilitate those interactions, but that's kind of all I had. Happy to take questions.
Great, thanks, Alexander. And I'll reach out to you on that as well. So any questions for Alexander on either the two bills presented or the budget, which I'm assuming, Alexander, in our weeklies, you'll keep us posted on where that all goes. And I see John Clark's hand. Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Alexander. That shark bill, I don't remember. You probably brought it up before. Could you give a little more detail on that? And also on the sportfish restoration that passed, did it have the fix for the overseas taxes that are missing right now, or is that still going to have to be done with a separate bill?
Yeah, so the Shark Act, I probably talked about it maybe a year ago. It's been around for a little while at this point. It comes from frustration of fishermen down mainly in Florida, although it was introduced by Senator Scott of Florida and shots of Hawaii, of sharks potentially being acclimated or learning from fishermen behavior and eating what people are reeling in and throwing back. It would bring together some subject matter experts on shark behavior, shark ecology. Folks from the councils and commissions would participate in trying to find kind of non-harming solutions, kind of deterrents to preventing shark depredation, so that fishermen can enjoy their catch. The Sportfish Restoration Reauthorization Bill does contain a language fix to kind of close that excise tax loophole that was from manufacturers overseas shipping their equipment directly to consumers. So they would, there's a fix for that.
Just quick follow up. I know with when the tariffs were put on all these small purchases, that is not related to the excise tax, right? That is just like if you order from China, you're still going to pay a tax, but that is not going to SFR if you purchase fishing gear that way, correct?
I believe that the tariffs are an added on top of whatever the excise tax would already be.
Any other questions for Alexander? Okay, not seeing any. Thank you, Alexander. Much appreciated. And as I said, we'll assume you will keep us updated on where the budget stuff goes. Let's see. Next, we have the review of what we had started at our last meeting on declared interest in voting privileges. We've kind of up here decided that probably the easiest way to do this is to try and divide and conquer. So I'm going to have Bob present on something that he sent out to the executive committee on declared interest, and then we will look at a possible path forward for talking about voting privileges. So I'll turn it over to you, Bob.
Great. Thank you, Joe, and good morning, everybody. So yeah, I'll just quickly run through a new discussion paper that we pulled together. It's one dated July 28th. It's in the supplemental materials. Mostly it focuses on declared interest, and then as Joe said, there's a piece at the end on a potential path forward to talk about voting privileges. And so starting with the declared interest part of the document, it begins with the three current criteria for declared interest. And I think the most important thing to remember about these criteria is the state only has to satisfy one of these criteria. It does not have to meet all three in order to be, in order to establish a declared interest in a species. So, I'll go through them quickly. Such fish are customarily in its territorial waters for a state, and there's a suggestion to change that to waters under state jurisdiction. The word customarily is interesting in both of these, but such fish are customarily or periodically in the territorial waters of a state for the purpose of spawning in or transit to and from spawning grounds. Then the third is citizens have recorded taking more than 5% of a Atlantic coast catch of a species in any one of the preceding 5 years. So that's a pretty low bar across all of these. And the first two are customarily is not really well defined. We've just, the policy board has sort of reviewed that and made decisions based on the evidence that's in front of them and just fairly been pretty generous. Yeah, John.
Just on that first one, could you just say where the waters under state jurisdiction, the difference between that and territorial waters?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so it would be such fish are found customarily in waters under state jurisdiction. I think the vice chair may have suggested that, so I will turn it over to him.
Thank you, Bob. In Massachusetts, we have the donut hole of Nantucket Sound, which was given to Massachusetts by Congress for fisheries management purposes. But when you look at a NOAA chart, you see the 3-mile limit that rims Cape Cod and the islands, but it doesn't really suggest that. It suggests that that is federal waters. And in fact, it is for, mining, energy development, any of that. So that's a term we use in Massachusetts so that we capture the donut hole of Nantucket Sound.
All right, so moving along through the document, as I said, notes that the policy board's been fairly generous in accepting any request to become a participant on a management board and have a declared interest. Moving along through the document, there's a few discussion questions that we've talked about in the past. Should declared interest criteria be modified? The three that I just mentioned. Are there changes needed to the review process by the policy board? Should voting privileges change as an oversight body? Should policy board voting privileges change as an oversight body? In other words, what issues should go back to the policy board from species management board? So there's certain things like approving letters that go out on behalf of the commission, or approving full amendments go to actually the full commission rather than the policy board. Should more things or fewer things go to the policy board for review that come out of species management board to maybe increase consistency across the commission, or just increase exposure to all the states along the coast that may be impacted by these different decisions? And then criteria C, which is the 5% in any one of the previous 5 years. Should that be modified or removed? There's some discussion about that in previous conversations by this group. And then, what should be the interval for reviews or reaffirmation of declared interest? Right now, if you're kind of on for life unless you decide to ask yourself to be removed. Should there be some sort of review that happens to verify that species is still occasionally, customarily, periodically in those states' waters, and that state really does still have a declared interest in that species? Obviously, if species move, that becomes more important and more relevant to think about. The one possible criteria, or an additional one or a replacement one, is suggested, which is such species is documented by landings and or scientific surveys to occur annually in the territorial waters of a jurisdiction for 3 consecutive years. So that says that species has showed up 3 straight years in that state's waters, and it's documented by landings or by surveys. And so that's a higher bar. Maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, to allow a state to have a declared interest in a species rather than the 5% once every 5 years. This has to be in that state's waters 3 straight years. And all those numbers can be, maybe 3 is not the right number, maybe 2 is, I don't know. And then customarily is the tricky word across these first 2 criteria. And then, should customarily be replaced by typically, commonly, regularly. Potentially such fish are found commonly in territorial waters. Commonly suggests, a greater frequency and widespread occurrence. Or it could be such fish are typically or periodically in territorial waters. Typically is sort of a usual pattern. So these are just similar words, but imply sort of different frequency and periodicity to the occurrence of those critters in that state's waters. And then the final piece on declared interest is how often should they be reviewed, the declared interest? And right now, status quo is, only when a state requests to add or remove themselves, the policy board considers that. Or should it be done on some regular interval, every 3 years, every 5 years, and maybe we can stagger all the species so we don't have to do 27 different species every 3 years or every 5 years. And then some sort of maybe a trigger where there's a new assessment, or there's noted that the distribution has significantly changed, or something along those lines that would trigger a review. So those are kind of the concepts of a declared interest, and should, what pieces of this should be changed. The 3 criteria, should they be removed, modified, added to? And then, how often should the policy board look back and say, okay, here's the list of species, and it's table number 1 in this document, displays where the states are right now. And it's not a surprise the mid-Atlantic states are on the most boards because they're kind of at the crossroads of the northern species and southern species. And as you sort of move toward the ends of our range, fewer and fewer species are have those far end, you know, the north and the south states have fewer declared interests and participate in fewer boards. So happy to answer any questions, but that's kind of the background that this group asked for to tee up this conversation. And then, do you want me to talk about voting privileges real quick, or hold off on
No, I say, let's take questions on this for now, and comments, obviously. I saw Roy Miller's hand, and then we'll go to you, Doug.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bob, where would a state like Delaware fall that a species like king mackerel, cobia, seldom occur in state waters, but they are landed from catches made in the EEZ, but customarily landed in Delaware? Would we be able to declare an interest in that particular species?
under the current criteria, that would sort of trigger or be focused on criteria C, which is landings or takings in the previous 5 years. So if there is evidence that those fish are landed in Delaware and it achieves 5% of the coastwide landings, then Delaware could be included in the cobia board, for example. We don't do king mackerel, but yeah.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think, to some extent, it would be interesting, for a species to understand how much of that fishery is persecuted in state waters and therefore under our purview or not. If it as Bob mentioned, king mackerel is not one, and then cobia went completely the other way as the federal government turned that over to us just a few years ago. So, I think the idea of kind of tracking this is very important. I've only been on the boards about a decade, and I can only think of one conversation about a state being removed from a management plan. It was an awkward one. I'll say that. So, I am curious what XCOM thinks about setting ourselves up for those reviews, if that is of interest to XCOM, and obviously, whatever we decide here will be going to policy board. So I'll look to other hands. I'm going to start with Doug Hamans.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So not just questions, but comments, right? So the possible alternative criteria that was added there on page 2, which starts with such species, Bob, you made a comment that it maybe raises the bar. To me, well, I won't say lowers the bar, but to me, it's a very eloquent way to define customarily. I think that sentence with a slight edit being to include Massachusetts' interest in waters of state jurisdiction. If we did that change, to me, that defines customarily. It's 3 years of either rec or scientific survey. So we take customarily completely out of play. And it also kind of brings from 5 years back down to 3, which makes it a little more open, I think. So I really like that alternative in replacement of all 3 of the others that are there now.
I see John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will just repeat what I brought up last time, is that as a state in the mid-Atlantic, a small state with small fisheries, I don't know that we really need to worry too much about this, because being on these boards for a state to declare interest, I mean, I think you really have to have interest. Like, as Roy was saying, we don't get many cobia in Delaware, but we do get them now. So, we're on the pelagics, but no offense to our friends in New England, but if we didn't have lobster, it would not be a problem for me if we did. So all I'm saying is I don't think that states take lightly asking to be on these boards. And, it is a responsibility to be on a board. And so I think there's no need to really tighten things up much. I don't have any problem with changing the language a little bit. But I mean, when we get to customarily, typically, usually, I think we're almost splitting hairs at that point. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, John. I appreciate that. Jason?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start by saying I agree with what John just said. And just to offer some broader thoughts that I've had, during the whole time we've been discussing this, I think it's a mistake to try and start to restrict, make ourselves less flexible on this stuff. I think one of the ways that I think about this declared interest, it's a strength of this body that a state can kind of see some data, see some signals. Hey, something is changing here due to climate change, for instance. And, we want to be a part of that management system before we have, you're sort of projecting out, looking at trends and making a decision to get on board so that you have a piece of the management that's being developed rather than having to come in. You now have a full-blown fishery in your state and all of the management's been set and you just kind of come in, after the fact and have to dig your way out or whatever. So I get really nervous about starting to put these really restrictive sideboards on this. I don't know that there's some big, massive problem that we're dealing with here. I think there was like one or two instances that, people were uncomfortable with and kind of prompted. And it's not bad to look at this stuff. I'm not saying anything about digging into this. I'm just offering that. Starting to try and get really explicit and put sideboards on this thing makes me really nervous. And I'll give an example. So you've got a species that's like cobia, I'll give cobia in Rhode Island. And that's exactly what I think about every time I'm reading this stuff. So it's a fishery. It's kind of like a pulse for us. We have a couple of good years and it's largely driven by MRIP intercepts. So we know what MRIP and these kind of intermittent species looks like, right? You get an intercept with them and that can blow up to a very big number and then you might not see them again for a couple of years. It's not that they're not there, it's that the data just aren't picking it up based on the systems that we have to collect it. And so, starting to say, well, it's got to be 3 years consecutive and you might be disenfranchising a state that legitimately has a fishery occurring in its state waters and it just doesn't have the systems around it that are robust enough to understand it. Same thing on the commercial side with cobia for us. A lot of our landings were coming out of our floating fish crop fishery. That fishery is in a transition now where there's very few of them and sometimes they have gear issues and they don't they don't put their nets in the water. So again, the fish are there. We didn't have the nets in the water to catch them in that particular year. So just a couple of kind of higher level thoughts for me. Again, like John, if we want to work on a couple of these specific terms, I'm okay with that. But to start to really put mathematical sideboards, it needs to be 3 consecutive years. I see that as highly problematic. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I do see a couple more hands. Jay, to that, I would just say, I can think of some examples in New Jersey that are similar. And I think, I'm almost ready to add social media to the criteria of proving because it does a much better job in many cases than MRIP. New Jersey was sitting as I believe the most northern state at the cyanids board. We were talking about coming out of de minimis for croaker. You might only see 1 or 2 MRIP intercepts. It might, put that at a few hundred fish. Yet at the same time, I was sitting next to Adam Nowalski, who had pulled up his laptop and is showing me trip after trip of for-hire boats just catching croaker all day. So, you know, it's a case where you could almost hide behind MRIP and say, well, we don't have a problem here. But if you're worried about the management of the species, then you need to have that flexibility to say, well, it's not being picked up in the survey, but we know we have to, you know, get in on this management program. And I think, you know, similarly with cobia, in a year where there was no harvest in New Jersey, we recorded the state record hook and line fish and the state record spearfish for cobia. So, yeah. Anyhow, we'll go to Lynn and then Erica.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I actually think that what I was going to say was covered. I think Jay went there, only he said it better. Yeah, I feel like we're starting to overthink this. And certainly cobia was the example for Maryland. There's not a 3 years we could find where we could prove we had cobia through a survey for 3 years in a row, but we know they're there. And if we can use social media, that would be great. But yeah, I think we just want to tread a little bit lightly here.
Excellent. Erica?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think that it's a little unfair to characterize legitimate concerns at the table as one-offs, which I'm hearing in some of the folks. But I feel like this issue could be resolved through one of two ways, either through declared interest or voting rights. The issue is states that are not actively managing fisheries, making decisions for states with robust fisheries. And I understand wanting to be part of the conversation, which any member of ASMFC is welcome to participate in board discussions. So maybe a declared interest is not necessary to weigh in on those conversations that shape what management looks like. But when really hard decisions come before states with established robust fisheries, to have non-participants in these fisheries or people that are states that are projecting future interest, which has not yet been realized, to weigh into those difficult conversations just muddies the water. It makes it more challenging. And so I share concerns. I think we could address it through either path. And I think it's important to have these discussions and sort out some new way forward, because the folks that we represent who work in these fisheries, live in these fisheries, participate in these fisheries customarily, they deserve to have their voices heard. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So I do think we have some, some differing opinions on this a bit, but this, in my mind, goes back to something I'm constantly telling Bob, and is in the document that he sent out too. Then, and it goes to that question of, well, what is policy board's role, right? Because all of these big decisions then go to policy board, and the origins of that predate me. But I think it's a decision on the appropriateness of a management board's decision, and everyone has a say, whether or not they're a big player in that fishery. And I think to your point, I think your point kind of brings into question that whole role of why would some members of a management board sit on their hands and not vote, and then turn around and make a decision on policy board on that same decision. So I kind of turn that over to all of the executive committee. Or not. Jason?
I mean, I think it's a really good point. I think if we were to do something, then it would need to be consistent, across both things. And then it kind of don't get the point of it going to the policy board. One of the things I like about the commission is that aspect of it where you have, folks that are smart and think about this stuff as part of their job or part of their daily life, weighing in on a situation that maybe isn't directly relevant to them, but they have, you know, applications elsewhere in their experience that they're kind of applying to it. So I've said this a number of times. I like that some people that don't have a strong vested interest are kind of thinking about these things and weighing in. You know, I understand maybe to look at it with a jaundiced eye, you know, that there's gamesmanship going on and you can try and just goose a couple of votes to get what you want. I don't see a ton of that going on. I think people are thinking about these things and, you know, voting per their best judgment. So, you know, so I think it needs to be holistic. If you're going to sort of start to constrain the board itself, then why wouldn't you then constrain that secondary piece of it as well, based on the same principles? And just to state clearly, I don't like that idea. I think it's a bad idea.
Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, it's kind of tricky to parse it out the way it's described, and I agree with Jay. I mean, theoretically, you can get into a situation where it's really states with either robust commercial fisheries or just large geographic areas, you know, getting, you know, most of the voting privileges, where smaller states with, you know, smaller coastlines and fewer fisheries are largely out of the game for a lot of the species we manage. That's a pretty big departure from how we've done things in the past. And I know we're probably bleeding into the next part of this that Bob's going to discuss, but you know, just my initial reaction is you know, that could really change how we do things around the table, depending on, you know, what direction we went based on some of the comments. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And I will, you know, Bob will get into that discussion a little bit. Again, I think we might need some help. Okay. On, you know, I think the idea of a survey to discuss, Bob and I were just sidebarring that, you know, maybe we can't decouple these two issues. Although maybe there isn't much of a problem with declared interest. Maybe this is really a discussion about voting privileges. You know, I have concerns about the idea of a survey to policy board. Only if you read about survey design, how challenging it is to ensure that you're not biasing, you know, results. But that is something we're going to have a discussion on. So I have Dennis Abbott, and then I'll go to Spud.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the work that's been done to make this paper available to us or whatever. But I think we're trying to fix a problem that really doesn't exist in large part. I was trying to draw some parallels. Having been in the legislature for many years, I sat at tables and voted on many things that I had no knowledge of really. You know, in the New Hampshire legislature, maybe every year we had 700 bills that I sat at a table or in the reps hall and voted on. I didn't know crap from Shinola about those bills, truth of matter. And I could give you some good examples. But again, before I voted on most important issues, I spoke with constituents, I spoke with other members of the House and whatever, and you use your best judgment. And I've seen good judgment used around this table. I've seen in certain species where certain votes came up and different members chose to abstain, or different states chose to abstain. So I think what has been occurring is completely satisfactory. And again, looking from a different viewpoint, I'm not a member of any department,
But I know, using New Hampshire as an example, I don't think that Renee Zobel's department, which was formerly Doug's department, have any interest in getting involved in species that they really have no interest in, because it just creates a burden for you. You know, plain and simple, they don't want to do it. And deviating from what I was just talking about, Roy Miller talked about something about landings in his state. If he doesn't, this is a question, and I don't know the answer. If cobia are landed in Delaware, is he required to have size limits, quotas, et cetera, if he's not participating in the board, or is it a voluntary thing for each state to enact regulations for species that they're not involved in? Like we've backed off from horseshoe crab management, the horseshoe crab management board some years ago, but we still have regulations on horseshoe crabs. But I don't know, I asked Doug and I think he told me that we really don't have to. So again, I go back to the first thing that I said. I think we're trying to fix a problem that really doesn't exist, and I'd just as soon see this set aside. Thank you.
Just quickly to your question, Dennis, I don't think it was rhetorical, about, what states have to implement regulations, really defined by the management unit. So whatever species management unit extends from whatever, South Carolina through Connecticut. Even if a couple of those states don't sit on that management board, they would be required to implement those regulations as established by that board.
And thank you. But then that's a good reason why they should be sitting on the board.
Thanks, Dennis. We'll go to Spud and then Lynn.
Thank you, Joe. I'm not on XCOM, but I appreciate the opportunity to comment. I'm certainly not interested in us, consuming our bandwidth on things that aren't important. I mean, we've got a lot to occupy us and a lot to do. But I do think that we have to remember that we're trying to manage fisheries in an environment vastly different than existed when a lot of these basic principles were created. I mean, we're seeing fish and other marine life move across time and space in very different ways than they did before. And I think it is responsible of us to periodically examine how we do business, what our rules of engagement are, to apply the principle of adaptive management. And obviously, the cobia allocation issue was the hot button thing that has sort of brought all this up. And there are differing opinions on whether that response was necessary or not. I think it was a good sort of sentinel reminder of we do need to take a look at these things. And I think when the rules of engagement are clear, everybody knows what is expected of them. When you leave things less defined, it can create opportunities for confusion. And back to this thing of the relationship between management boards and policy board, if you think about how the councils work, we have committees, and ultimately it goes back to the full council. And it's kind of the same thing on a smaller scale. And I think, for instance, why would Georgia vote yes or no on anything to do with lobster? Should we discipline ourselves to abstain when those kind of things, or do we just go, sure, whatever? Because a lot of times that's what happens. Is there's a respect that the management board has conducted the deliberations that were necessary to produce a good decision, and then the policy board says we concur with that. So I do think that these types of efforts are important. If not, and we may not change a thing, but at least it indicates that we're willing to be introspective of how we do things to make sure that they are the best in the current situation that we face. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. I without question, I think there have been times where board members are voting and just hoping to support those states that are affected instead of abstaining. And maybe that's a thought for all of us. I also appreciate you being here and many other members being here who aren't necessarily on XCOM part of the commission. And I would ask that if others would like to speak on the commission, then please also address that you're not on the executive committee. I think that's important for the record, but I think it's also important to have commissioners be involved in helping us out through this, since this is going to policy board anyway, and we'll all have comments. You know, I think about something like horseshoe crab, and I don't know if it's necessarily because New Jersey has a moratorium. I never really thought about other states voting on what happens in Delaware Bay, which is what so much of the conversation is always about, right? And that is kind of a greater ecological interest. But I do know, and I've said it on the record, I'm not afraid to say it, that at times a particular state may be under certain pressures that actually put it beyond what the resource needs. You know, the resource may need to have reductions in a fishery, and that state simply cannot vote on that. And other states can address the appropriateness of what that resource needs. And so, you know, I think that in discussions on limiting it to just the states that it matters to, I think we could be putting ourselves in a spot at times. So I guess Lynn next, and then I'll go to Roy Miller, and then Ben.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just quickly, in consideration of, you know, thinking about voting rights, so where does this sort of construct leave our federal partners, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and National Marine Fisheries Service, that sit on the boards, who generally would say that they abstain in issues of allocation, but they do vote on conservation, but they're not, you know, practicing in a fishery? So I'm just kind of curious how we would feel, you know, how we'd be consistent across the board with them in the mix.
Yeah, well, Bob said, you know, he could speak to the charter language, but otherwise, to be honest, I don't think that that's a question that's come up in this discussion and would probably need to, but go ahead, Bob.
I don't think it's an answer necessarily, Lynn, but you know, the charter currently allows National Marine Fisheries Service and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to participate in a board if they choose to do so. So, you know, Fish and Wildlife Service is generally limited to diadromous species, and National Marine Fisheries Service sits in on essentially all the boards. So unless that charter language is changed, I think they would still have the opportunity to participate in a board if they chose to do so. So you know, their participation really isn't determined by the policy board. It's if they're interested in participating, they're allowed to do so under the current guidance.
Gonna go to Roy and then Ben.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to drill down on this just a little deeper, if I may. Let's take a species for which there are a northern stock has been differentiated versus a southern stock, like red drum. And maybe Erica was thinking of that when she spoke. Should a northern state be voting on an allocation or compliance issue for the southern stock, a red drum? And conversely, should a southern state be voting on allocation or compliance for the northern stock of red drum, just to take a specific example? So I'd be curious of everyone's thoughts on that particular matter, because I don't think we resolved this last time around on red drum. And I detected some uncertainty and some differences of opinion when it came up. Thank you.
You just want to open a can of worms, all right?
If, Mr. Chairman, if I may add, you know, we all sit on these species boards. We hear the same technical information. We hear the same reports of the technical committee. Personally, I would value Erica's opinion if we were discussing weakfish, let's say, which is probably not a highly abundant species down her way. Perhaps she would welcome participation by a board member in cobia or red drum, those kinds of things, and would welcome that, let's call it informed opinion. Thanks.
Thanks, Roy. I mean, living through the summer flounder and black sea bass reallocations in 2 different states. I moved in the middle of black sea bass reallocation. And I think about New York's appeal. I don't think that should have just stayed with, or could have gotten possibly the right conclusion without the involvement of policy board and everybody. Again, it goes to the appropriateness of that discussion, where, Connecticut had an additional allocation that New York didn't get within New York's, within Long Island Sound. And that was a successful appeal that kind of turned that decision over. I can't think of any better or tougher example of what we've gone through in the past decade or 2 on those types of decisions. And so as far as my answer to you, I'll put that out there. I think there are times where we need all hands on deck, so to speak. And online, so Ben, you're the only other hand in the queue right now, and you don't necessarily have to. I know you had your hand up before Roy's question, so.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I mean, I guess my comment would kind of tangentially get at some of Roy's comments. I think the problem here, or some of the concerns I hear, is that it's very difficult to project all the different scenarios where this might come into play and come into effect, and all the different boards and all the different species, and especially when those things, as Spud has mentioned, is changing, right before us. So, I don't really have, unfortunately, some great answers, but definitely some comments. And when typically a lot of us are regulators, managers, we're trying to make a decision on certain things, and I like quantifiable measurements to make those decisions based on, right? And so if we're trying to determine, who has and who has not declared interest, I look at the current criteria, and there's only one that's quantifiable. But I definitely hear Jason's concerns and others that there's a potential for those, maybe if it's, we're not seeing the landings every 3 years as a pulse fishery, or maybe that state doesn't necessarily have the scientific surveys or the funding, or they're not targeting those surveys, so they wouldn't have that ability. I can see those concerns. And so kind of taking points from everybody here, Erica, mentioned maybe that's not necessarily, it's either one or the other in voting versus the declared interest. And if we're not going to determine it, I feel like it's almost one way or the other, that if it's going to be this very discretionary kind of what currently is, just a request to be on de minimis, and it's very discretionary, very open, very free, I don't see the point at all of having anything quantifiable. Because why then, if you can meet any one of these 3, and it's just customarily kind of in my waters as it passes through every now and then, what's the point of having to have 5% of every last 5 years? It just doesn't make sense to me. And then therefore, although I do, it makes it sense. Then if you're going to say that, then why review it? I would kind of disagree with that, though, because I still think it's important to at least bring those questions up, like we were talking about here. I don't think these things should just be in perpetuity. We need to review them, and it makes sense to have something more a trigger base, just to look at it, and not necessarily on a recurring basis annually to burden everyone, but just pose that question. Does this make sense? And in that light, a thought that I was having is maybe that does come into voting privileges. And I think where the rubber meets the road is, Roy mentioned the word, and I was going to say it, is allocations. I think that's really where some of this is going to really come to a head, is when you're starting to kind of talk about how much fish each state can get and have access to, an opportunity to, for their constituents. And I think that's the really toughest thing that we do around this table, or at least in my short time have come to see. So I would be interested in seeing the conversation. I don't really mention the survey might not be the right way, but more conversations about that voting privileges and something similar to like we're having discussions on conservation equivalency. If there's some overall kind of policy or kind of guidelines that could be set for some of that, if it's only focused on allocations or voting privileges, or there's a weighted vote, or I don't know, but something to that degree. And then each board could then determine if they want to use it or not use it, kind of like conservation equivalency, because then it could be specific to that board, specific to those states that are within that board. And then I guess the problem there though is who's voting on that, and do you have the voting rights within that board? It's complicated. I don't have an answer, but I would be interested to continue to flush this out. I'm not saying do away with a quantifiable measure. I like quantifiable measures if we're trying to determine and make a decision on something that makes it clear, as kind of Spud said. So I like the fact that you can have a measure of landings or surveys, but again, I understand the concerns and see those pitfalls. So maybe that's where it moves it into the voting privileges. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I think you brought up a really important point. We're having discussions about a state choosing to sit on a board and whether or not we ask them to step off of that board, but we're not having discussions about the kicking and screaming of a state that may have now 5% of the landings and hasn't offered to sit on that board when they absolutely need to be a part of it. So, the quantifiable measure there, I think would address that. What we saw in, for those of us that sit on cyanids, that, through the de minimis policy, or I think it's less than one, if you're coming in at greater than or 1% over a 3-year average or 5-year average, that you're out of de minimis. Well, at some point you're gonna, I think, have to be sitting on a board that if you're 5% or more of the coastwide landing. So I think there may be a reason for a quantifiable measure in that, but it is certainly something to think about. Yeah, Jeff, I think. Yeah, Jeff, you might be the last hand we have so far on this.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm not a member of the executive committee, but if further consideration of these questions occurs, I'd like Atlantic Menhaden to be kind of front and center, because I know there's no landings in the 3 states sitting at the end of the table here for that. Although they have an interest in the fishery, historical interest, that's fine with me. I have no problem with them voting on Menhaden, but if we lose the opportunity to vote on fish that are now occurring in our region, I'm going to have a significant problem with that outcome. Fair is fair. I was a legislator also. We did 600 bills a year. We relied on the committees to tell us what the options were, what the information is, exactly like we do here. Everybody gets a chance to vote. We're all commissioners. We're all appointed to be here in one way or another. And to minimize our ability to vote because we don't have X, Y, Z of number of fish or landings is very problematic to me. And again, I use Atlantic Menhaden as the lens through which I make that comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Bill?
Thank you. I'll just offer a perspective that echoes much of what has been said so far, but maybe with a little different twist. I get the general feeling in interactions with the public and with public officials back home and in a broader sense that the credibility of this commission is enhanced the broader the perspectives, the broader the involvement in the discussions as possible. And I think it's that broad involvement that protects us from criticism in many instances, because decisions aren't made by a narrow narrowly defined group of states. And so I just think that should be that sort of general broad public support outside and beyond anglers, outside and beyond commercial fishermen. But in terms of the general public, sort of needs to be taken into consideration in these discussions. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I think, you know, when I keep mentioning horseshoe crab, I think of that as kind of a perfect example of that. So I see Erica's here.
Just to correct the record, Florida has menhaden landings.
Thank you. Jay?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I really, I mean, I've appreciated all the comments, but thinking about what Ben said, I had a couple of thoughts that popped into my head, you know, as he was kind of outlining his points. So I wonder, you know, the notion of kind of reviewing on some cycle, I don't see an issue with that. And so I was kind of thinking about that a little bit, and then wondering, well, what would you review? You know, would you just kind of put it up against the three things we have now, or some modified version of that? But I wondered if maybe what can happen is when a state declares an interest, maybe they justify that declaration. They kind of say why they're declaring an interest, and they sort of offer some tangible reasons. You know, like in the case of Cobia, Rhode Island, I would have said, yeah, we had some pretty high landings in our commercial fishery from our floating fish traps for a couple of years. And, you know, I'd kind of outline those things. And so when you do the review, you kind of have that justification, and that's kind of what you are looking at. And then that's the, you know, quantifiable, you know, whatever it is, like you have some things that you're looking at, and, you know, yep, those are still the case, or no, our situation has really changed, and we'd like to modify that declared interest or what have you. So I just wanted to offer the thought as maybe something actionable that we can kind of carry forward here, flesh out a little bit more.
Thanks, Jay. I mean, to me, that reminds me of what we kind of did with our CE policy. You know, the fact that it isn't just a CE policy in perpetuity, that it does have to be revisited and to some extent, if not defended, then at least explained. You know, and I think there's certainly a fairness to that idea. And again, I also do, thanks to Ben, think about, you know, the reverse of all of this, of a state maybe not wanting to come into the management plan, but having that requirement of, well, you need to be part of these discussions. You're now a player. So I don't think I have any other hands right now. And this was only supposed to be the first part of this. Again, we're you know, gonna at least talk about, you know, the possibility of a way forward on voting privileges and the potential for a survey. I was going to turn that over to Bob. I know, you know, this would go to policy board. We would want to hear from all of our commissioners. I'm assuming an anonymous survey, but, you know, it's very tough to design surveys. And one of the discussions is, you know, should you be at least explaining what region you're from? So, I mean, just throwing that out there, I think we're kind of hinting at some of the challenges that would be associated with this, but I'll turn it over to Bob.
Great, thanks, Joe. And you know, the notion of a survey or a work group is just sort of brainstorming between Dan and Joe and I, trying to figure out, you know, how to move forward. This is a complex issue, and having, you know, the 17 people on the executive committee or 45 people or more on the policy board tackle this just maybe too many. You know, we may need a more concrete sort of starting point before we can you know, make some progress. So the idea of a survey came up. That the survey would be designed essentially to get at the 4 questions that are on the last page, or page 3 of this document, voting privileges for de minimis states, voting by stock unit, voting privileges for states outside the defined management unit in the FMP, and voting privileges for states on boards that manage multiple species. So, we've got boards that manage summer flounder scup and black sea bass, and New Hampshire only votes on black sea bass, for example. And should those type of things be incorporated into other boards that manage multiple species? So that's the idea, but designing a survey to get at those questions is very tricky, and you probably need a specialist so that the questions aren't leading, and there's no bias injected by the way the questions are asked, and it doesn't mean it's a bad idea, but I just is that effort really going to shed a lot of light on where the states are, or is that just an effort to get sort of the notions around the table that we've all been talking about, just get that on paper, or do we already have a sense of where a lot of folks are, and a survey wouldn't be that productive? But I think the idea of a work group of some sort may be a good idea, but that's just my opinion to move this forward. It's hard to do it with a big group. It's hard to do it constrained by the time of an executive committee, and so that's kind of the idea here. I can talk more about it if you want, but I think the idea is just collectively, what's the best path forward? This is a complex issue, or these are complex issues if you include declared interest and voting. They seem to be getting smeared together, which makes a lot of sense during this conversation. So the work group may be tasked with addressing both of these issues together. So I guess it's really up to the group. What do you guys think the best course is to move forward? Talking about it over and over and over is interesting and relevant, but probably not going to get us to a resolution of some sort.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I will say on the declared interest, I kind of would like to see, as Doug mentioned, he thinks there's some wording that gets us in a better place with it. So I didn't mean to just completely move on from declared interest. I think this is something that we can present some wording that gets rid of customarily and kind of cleans things up. And if the discussion is really more so about voting privileges than declared interest, then I think the notion of a survey, as scary as it is to me, is important, because I've sat on just about every darn work group that we've come up with, and I don't know that I want to sit on this one if that's the way we decide to go. It's an incredible challenge, but I will say this before I turn it over to XCOM on the idea of a survey or a working group. We're getting ready to turn over the chair and elect a new chair and vice chair. I find incredible value in the fact that we rotate regionally. I think it's extremely important to how we operate. And sitting in the Mid-Atlantic all these years, I will say that I envy the North and South for being able to sit out some of these decisions. But at the same time, I absolutely value that objectivity that exists when you are sitting it out. To look at striped bass from the outside, or look at the lobster fishery from the outside, I think there's great value in that. And so I really think that plays in to this idea of either a work group or how we tackle the survey, because I think it's absolutely inherent in how we make our decisions. So I'll leave it at that and then open it up to everyone. And I see Jason's hand. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just maybe, hopefully this is what you're looking for, but I don't like the idea of a survey. So I kind of took your points, Bob, and agree with them. I was kind of thinking as I was reading through, like, we do a survey, then what is that, like does the majority like win? Like, I just didn't know what we would actually do with that information in the end. But I like the idea of a work group. I also don't think I want to be on it, Joe. But you know, I think at the very least, there'll be some value in somebody having some focused thinking on what's happening now. I would imagine that'd be the first step of the work group, is that what's going on now, what are the rules, how do people operate? Having that written down, I think would be really valuable. Where we go from there, I won't prejudge, but so I see some value in a work group in a couple of contexts.
John?
I agree with Jay. I'd rather see a work group, maybe 2 from each region, go that way, because I think surveys are difficult to set up, as you said, and you know, we could still argue over the results of that. I think this way we get more agreement for the whole of ASMFC if it was regionally balanced work group.
Thanks, John. Carl?
Well, in my extensive experience sitting at this board, second meeting, you know, I think joining this group as a manager, as opposed to a technical member, it's a very different perspective, and there's a very different spirit amongst the board this time around, which is very appreciative for a new member. I would definitely support a working group, and I would willingly serve on that group as well, because I just think at this point, from my personal experience, I think this body has so much good to go for it that I think having a divisive issue is problematic, obviously, for a decision body like this. Thank you.
Dennis?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Being a long-standing member of the commission, just about 29 years, a little history. I don't have Tom Foti here to help me with history of the commission. But the only people that I remember that were board members back when I started, it was, I think, Dave Borden. I don't think there's anyone else that can say they were part of this commission back 29, 30 years ago. Well, I don't know if I don't know if Roy was a voting member or a commissioner at the time. Whatever. I don't want to slight, I'm not trying to slight you, Roy, by any means, but I'm just a little history lesson. When I became a commissioner in 1997, my first meeting was in Norfolk, Virginia. And I was thinking that I was really joining something that was quite important, and I left my legislative duties behind and I trekked down to Norfolk, Virginia, and I went to the first meeting and I found out that I didn't have anything to do. I didn't have any boards to sit on. I was just, you know, a paperweight. I had no value whatsoever. And I left important things behind in the legislature. And I didn't like that. I says, if I'm going to be there, I want to have some voice in things. And as I say, at that time, the 30 LGAs had no vote. You didn't participate in decisions, save you had one token legislator and one token governor's appointee assigned to a board, and they were supposed to represent that group. I don't know how one legislator was really supposed to sit on a board and vote. Does he vote his own mind, his state's mind, or is he supposed to be voting for the entire group of legislators? So again, in short order, again with Tom Foti and myself and several others, and probably with Dave Borden's help, we changed things. And as you see now, there are 45 commissioners who have, you know, not their own vote, but they're part of the state delegation. As Carl Wilson says, he's looking at things differently now and appreciating how we operate and the collective wisdom that we have. So again, I don't know what I'm getting at, but voting privileges are important. And if you're going to be sitting on a board, then you should have voting privileges that shouldn't be hindered in any way, shape, or fashion. Thanks.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands, but we've had at least 3 comments in favor of a working group and not a survey. So I guess the direct question to XCOM is there any objection to that notion that we move forward with a working group? John Clark put forward the suggestion. Oh, Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I am not on XCOM, so I appreciate the ability to comment. I mean, I'm not that thrilled about a survey, and I'm not all that certain about a working group because Switzerland is not on this board. So if a working group is formed, I really think somehow you're going to have to get people who are unbiased, period. I mean, I sat on the Mid-Atlantic Council as liaison for New England for a long time. And, I could talk all I wanted, but I didn't get the vote. And Rhode Island, of course, has more Loligo landings than the rest of the states combined. So I feel the frustration there, absolutely. But I just think if we're going to go down the working group road, you're going to have to bring the Swiss in to be as unbiased as possible for the outcome of that working group. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I agree that it is a challenge. I just briefly looked to both Bob and Dan, and I think there's a notion here that that it would be a working group blessed by policy board to some extent. I think, especially because of something that Jay laid out, and really that'll become a task for staff more than anything on laying out some examples of how things look. And I think we've had discussions on those. I think of some of these small management units like TOG, where it's Connecticut and New York, or New York and New Jersey, and someone else has to help make that decision if those 2 states disagree. But bringing those types of things forward, I guess, could be helpful. So yeah, this is a tough one. Again, I think if the notion is that we do try to move forward, we can have the discussion at policy board on who those members would be. Since I think, we'd want to open that up. Bill?
Yeah, I want to follow up on what Eric said. I also fall into the camp where I don't know that a survey makes sense, and I don't know that a working group makes sense. It's maybe I'm hearing it through my own viewpoint, but I'm hearing generally around the table that everybody agrees that it's worthwhile to have these periodic discussions, that this was called for and it was useful. But I sense that there's a general agreement that things are okay the way they are now, given the higher sensitivity to the issue that's prevailed from this discussion. So I almost wonder if the best approach is to let this sit and do what I think Spud was suggesting at some point, just revisit this issue a couple of years down the road instead of trying to spin our wheels more based on the discussion that's been had. I just don't know that anything would come out of a work group.
Well, if we wait just one more meeting, then I could turn this over to Dan. So I'm more than happy with it. Sorry, okay. So I think then we have a bigger discussion. This isn't just, I'm going to ask for objections to taking a work group to policy board. I'm going to say that if there is a decision for a work group, then I'd probably like to see a motion out of XCOM. And if not, then we will report to policy board that we had a discussion, and really no conclusion on, on moving that forward. So. Yeah, go ahead, John.
I move that the executive committee set up a working group to further develop suggestions, I guess you'd call it, to the declared interest policy. And that working group should have 2 XCOM members from each region.
Is there a second to John's motion?
I'll second it.
Jamie? Okay. We have a motion and a second. Discussion on the motion. And I would ask that if we, particularly to the notion, because this is a tough thing, and we do have folks that come to this, to these XCOM meetings that I think add incredibly valuable input, that are not actually on XCOM. John's motion is to these members being on XCOM only and not policy board. So discussion on the motion. Please, some hands. Dennis.
Yes, thank you. I'll go along with Bill Hyatt that I don't think that it's necessary or serves any good value at this time to establish a working group. I think that the thought of just putting this aside and continuing as we are is the best course of action at this time. So I'll be voting against this motion.
David.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Really brief comment. I just suggest that given the workload that some of the state directors have, you may want to add in 2 executive committee members or their designees behind it so that they can designate someone from their state to do the work.
Question, I'm going to go to Bob.
Yeah, a question for John. In the motion, it notes declared interest, but are you also considering that this working group will tackle voting privileges as well? Okay.
Go ahead, John. Follow up to.
Yeah, and just, was there a second, or is this?
Jamie Green was the second.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, that's not a.
Okay, no, I just, as I said, I certainly understand the comments from Bill and Dennis and David about just leaving this be for now, but I think there would be some value. I mean, we've already had some, I think, good ideas that have come up here that I think the working group could further look into those. And I'm not looking for, a treatise from the working group, maybe just to look further into some of the ideas that have come up today. And, it could be that after the working group meets this, I'm not looking for anything intensive. And the executive committee says, well, this is kind of where we were anyhow, but we're not going to go any further with this. But you never know, maybe we could come up with some real agreement through that process.
Okay, thank you, John. I'm going to go to Chris Bat-Savage and then Jamie Green.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'm torn on whether or not we're going to be able to accomplish what we want in a working group for the reasons already given. And one thought I had was who's going to chair it? Because I think we all have a very big interest in this, and that's not unlike other working groups that we've had. But this one's a little different than species specific ones. Yeah, I'm still thinking this through. I see some value in trying to sort out the declared interest, but the voting privileges, I think I'm falling in the camp of let this one lie. I think the process we have right now is working. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Go to Lynn. Sorry. Well, go ahead, Lynn, and then Jamie. My apologies, and then Spud.
Yeah, thanks. I guess I do have a little agita about this, but to Eric's point, sort of about an unbiased arbiter in here, I wonder, is there any utility to requesting that somebody like a commission attorney sit on this group to to, I don't know if that's useful or worse or.
Yeah, I mean, I think back to like what we did with horseshoe crab and had a facilitator, which maybe is a little bit cheaper than a lawyer, but still an expense. But certainly a thought. And again, this is, if this motion passes, it will be going to policy board. So I apologize. I want to go to Jamie Green and then Spud and then Mel.
It's all right. I'm used to you forgiving me, Joe. That's all good. But ladies first. I wanted to get one clarification before I make a comment. The gentleman over there mentioned on the motion, could we add the executive committee members or their designee as the seconder? I accept that modification. I don't know if the motioner will. I don't see it on the board. So if we can add that or their designee. One, and I totally understand, because I've always said this, I'm deaf by working group, deaf by committee. We all are, and we're all very busy. However, this is a very sensitive issue, obviously, and this is one of the things that I've ran into that I can agree with both sides of the argument. There's some substance to both sides, and so I think sending this to a working group is wise. It's not a final. It gives them more time, a group more time to hash it out instead of us trying to do it here. And the fact that it's insinuating that if you have a certain opinion, you can't be rational is ridiculous. And this body has proven that we can be rational, even when we have differences of opinion. So I would think that the working group would be useful to chew this up and bring it back so we don't have to do this and constantly chew it up here next time.
Thank you, James. But
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Again, I'm not on XCOM, but I was just going to recommend that Marty Gary did such a good job with the Manhattan work group. No, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that. But you had already mentioned, I think it would be extremely valuable to have this facilitated by a neutral party to kind of get to what Eric was saying. I think whatever it costs would be well worth it, because I think it does. It not only will, I think it create a better atmosphere for meaningful discussion, it will ensure that those of us who receive the products of that work group have confidence that the deliberations were as fair as they could be. So that was just my suggestion.
yeah, thanks, Bud. I mean, I've certainly been through my fair share of facilitators in the fisheries world as offshore wind became a larger part of our life. That has expanded quite a bit in the past few years, and I certainly see the value in having that. So I think it's a great thought. And as you mentioned, you're not on XCOM, so you are lucky on this motion, my friend. I'm going to go to Mel and then Carl.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not on the committee, and I was simply going to come to the same conclusion, which is I think I would encourage the committee to not just sort of put this aside, because the underlying issue is here because of things beyond our control, which is 40 years ago or so, we thought we were sort of in a static world, and all the stocks kind of stayed put, and they were nice and well behaved, but that's changed now. So we're obviously in a dynamic situation where things are moving. Numerous species are moving, and they're moving north. A lot of stuff moving south. It seems to be moving north. So the issue is not going to go away. So I would encourage you to go ahead and deal with this. And I think a facilitated process is the way to go. I've dealt with some things in my other life where we had to make decisions involving the Coast Guard and the Navy and how we were going to work together. And those, believe me, the Coast Guard had an opinion and the Navy had an opinion. But the way we did that was through a facilitated process with an outside facilitator, whether paid or provided somehow. So I would encourage moving forward in some sort of facilitated process. And you know, you can say, well, let's just kind of put this off, but it's not going to go away. And this is the product of what we knew was coming with climate change, water temperature changes. We knew things were going to become dynamic. And the big challenge in my mind was always, you know, fish are going to do what fish are going to do, but how is the governance of all that? How are we going to deal with groups like this? How are we going to deal with it? And we're in the middle of it right now. So thank you.
Thanks, Mel. I'm going to go to Carl, and then I'll call the question, but I'll say that we'll consider the facilitator kind of part of this, you know. So I think that as we vote on, if we're going to move this forward, that'll be part of that. Go ahead, Carl.
Just a quick question on the bounds. Is there a time frame for this group? Should we limit that?
That's a question to the committee. Go ahead, Bob.
This is a, you know, heavy issue, obviously, and I don't think it can be sorted out by a committee with a facilitator before the annual meeting. But I think a report back on the status of this at the annual meeting is realistic. You know, establish the committee, maybe get a facilitator signed up, and at least have one conversation and maybe some staff work on pulling together some additional background to help the process. I think we can do that by the annual meeting, and then, you know, probably set the course or the timeline for wrapping this up, if that's possible, at the annual meeting. That's kind of what's in my head anyway. It's up to the group if that works or not.
Jamie?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would agree with Bob's point of view there. Once the group gets established and meet, it'll give you a better time with the annual meeting to kind of where they're at and how long it might take them to come to whatever the conclusion is or lack of a conclusion.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, I'd like to see some cleaned up wording. I think we could do some work on declared interest as well. Obviously, you know, this might be where we actually are able to decouple and clean up declared interest a little bit. And so if that comes up at the annual meeting, I'd be happy to, you know, at least be able to put that part of it aside. And then, you know, I'm going to call the question now on the motion at hand. So all of those in favor? Opposed? Two. Okay. Any abstentions? Not seeing it. Okay. So we have it's a 12 in favor to 2 opposed vote. So this motion passes, and we will provide more information on this. Where it's going to be going. You know, we'll let policy board know where executive committee has landed on this. The motion is that it's XCOM members or proxies for those members. So we'll be letting policy board know that as well. And then we'll be looking for those members. I guess we can do that by email and yeah, and you'll have to give us some time to find a facilitator, but I think that's a very good idea. I see Erica's hand.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Question about process. Since the motion says 2 members or their designee from each region, if we're going to handle this by email, do the regions, and do we need to define them explicitly, need to decide who they want their representatives to be separately before we put those names forward?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I you know, I think to some extent, yes. I was going to say that there's a council level of regional definition that we don't necessarily always use, and we have our friends over in North Carolina that manage to straddle council borders as well. So Yeah, I think, you know, in the interest of time, part of finding members will be defining areas as well, I guess. Yeah, you know, people always talk about the role of chair. Obviously, so much work is handled by staff, but one of the roles of chair is to this exactly. So yeah, if we do have more interest in seats, then that'll fall to me, I guess. Okay. We're good? All right. All right, thank you, folks. This is, you know, it's just another step in the process. Very much appreciate Mel kind of wrapping that up for us and the importance of this and that it's not the same place we were when this commission was established. And so happy to, you know, kind of keep moving this ball forward. Obviously, someone after me will still be dealing with this, and for today we'll move on. So we're going to future annual meetings, and I'll turn it over to Laura.
Thank you, Joe. We are looking forward to a meeting in Dewey Beach, October 26th through 30th. John or Roy, do you want to say anything?
We're going to have another meeting today to iron out some of the logistics in terms of the annual banquet and the Monday night social. But so far we have a pretty good lineup in mind, and I think you'll find it be an enjoyable meeting and well worth attending. It has the advantage of being, the backside of it is on Rehoboth Bay, and the front side is a couple blocks from the ocean, so it has all those advantages as a meeting location. Thanks.
Thank you, Roy. And then 2026, we're going to be in Rhode Island. We're starting to solicit hotel bids right now. You want to say anything, Jay?
Maybe just real quick, I think we're targeting Newport, which is super fun. That's where it was, I think, the last time, 15 years ago or whatever it is. So yeah, looking forward to hosting you all in sunny Newport, Rhode Island.
Thank you. And then we'll be 2027, we'll be back in South Carolina, 2028, Massachusetts, 2029, Pennsylvania, 2030, Georgia, and then 2031, Connecticut. That concludes my report.
Thank you. Any questions for Laura? Not seeing any. Okay, great. I am going to put in a plug. When we usually do our awards luncheon, typically on a Wednesday, we give out those awards. There's gift cards for the tournament, for your tournament. I really think that we should have an email go out to the boards and say, who had the worst travel experience at last year's annual meeting, and whoever that will decide who that person was who had the worst travel experience, and they get one of those gift cards from the fishing tournament, because we've all got those stories, man. Anyhow. But, you know, travel to Dewey Beach, I mean, what could be easier? So is there any other business to come before executive committee? Not seeing any. Okay, so XCOM is going into closed session, so we're going to have to ask some folks in the room to leave. We'll be disengaging from our online. We're going to be doing a litigation update, and we're going to be doing an update on the CARES Act. For everyone's information that's listening in or in the room, I will give an update on these items in our at policy board on my summary for executive committee, but we are going to move into closed session right now. So if folks not on XCOM, although we are allowing